The webinar has started.
Continue. And we've lost Todd now.
So I lost your picture and sound, Todd. Just got a SLT banner.
Recording in progress.
Yep.
Oh.
We are live, folks.
Okay.
We're live,
So don't swear.
Yes, that means I need to start. I'm looking for some notes from my fellow panelists that we can launch. I'm sure there'll be other people joining us as we go, but we want to have as much time as we can for Paul, so we'll start on time. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first of Sustainable Living Tasmania's webinars called Food for Thought. We thought that the world is, well, to be frank, is in a mess, and we all need to do what we can, where we can, and we need new ideas to inspire us. So we wanted to make an opportunity for members and supporters of Sustainable Living Tasmania to share with the people who have got new ideas to share with us, to inspire us and move the furniture in our brains a bit. I'm Margaret Stedman, and I'm currently the president of Sustainable Living Tasmania. And I welcome you to this first webinar. And I'm on the land of today. I'm on the land of the Noongar people in Western Australia, taking care of a daughter recovering from an operation. And I think that most of you will be on the land of the Palawa people in Lutruwita, Tasmania. And we want to begin our session this evening by acknowledging the Palawa people, acknowledge their care for country over millennia. We acknowledge their elders, past and present, and recognise their care of country. There is a great deal we who are not Indigenous have to learn about how to live sustainably on the land from Indigenous people. Hope you've seen I'm reading my notes. Let me be upfront here. I'm reading my notes in a rather not very clear light here. So if I'm mumbling, then please excuse me. I didn't want to forget what I needed to say. I hope you've seen some of our work in SLT over the last year, in particular the appointment of a new community engagement coordinator, Sandy Astle, and she's busy creating a sustainability calendar for Tasmania, and which is a 50th birthday celebration, and we're going to organise a big event for March next year, and we hope you will engage with all of the things that we're doing. And I'm going to hand over now to Helen Pryor, who many of you will know, and she's going to be introducing our speaker, Paul Gilding. Thanks, Helen, and welcome to everybody. Over to you, Helen.
Hi, thanks, Margaret. Welcome everybody. It's great to have you all along for the e-forum, for our first e-forum tonight. It's my great pleasure and privilege to welcome Paul Gilding as our first e-forum speaker in our Food for Thought series. Paul is an eclectic environmental advocate and activist. His experience ranges from heading up Greenpeace International to running a successful community energy saving program called Easy Being Green, to advising global corporations like Unilever and BHP Billiton, with lots in between. He is a philosopher, theorist, practitioner, giving him multiple insights. His acclaimed book, The Great Disruption, now over 10 years in print, prophesies the transformations we are witnessing now with the climate emergency well and truly upon us. It is challenging, realistic, and optimistic all at once. Paul also publishes a regular bulletin called the Cockatoo Chronicles, which explores the implications of businesses having to make rapid, sustainability-driven changes to stay relevant. The latest issue focuses on the food industry, something which is going to be a major theme for tonight's forum. Welcome, Paul, and thank you very much for agreeing to present Sustainable Living Tasmania's first Food for Thought forum. Paul will be speaking for about 20 minutes, followed by a Q&A session. We'd like to invite you to post questions via the Q&A link at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and Paul and Todd will moderate those questions when he's finished speaking. Thank you.
Sorry, thank you. Thanks very much, Helen and Margaret and Todd, for having me on tonight. Great to talk to this audience. I don't do many things in Tasmania because that's where I hide from the world. So it's very nice to engage with all of you, and I see many of my friends online there. So good to talk to you all. Look, I really wanted to start with the heading which I put out for the kind of description of my talk. Which is a very sort of obvious idea, but I think one we've forgotten, is that when things are unsustainable, they stop. And I always start with that idea because we've kind of come to think of sustainability as a nice to have, right? It's a good thing to be. Wouldn't it be nice if things are more sustainable and things are a little bit difficult if they're not sustainable? But it doesn't actually describe what the word means. When things are unsustainable, they stop. Now, they might not stop quickly, they might not stop smoothly, but they will stop. And that as an idea, I think is very powerful, because what it means is that, you know, our global economic model, which is unsustainable, will stop. Now, I want to talk a bit about what stopping means in that context, but the idea of an infinite growth on a finite planet, as we've known since the Club of Rome and since, is of course a insane and absurd idea. You can't have infinite growth in a physical economy on a finite planet. Now, even though it's such a powerful and such an obvious idea, it is so deeply embedded in our society and our politics and our economic theory and the behavior of all of us and all of our companies that we actually can keep on growing, right? And the economy can keep on growing. In fact, it is not just a nice thing to have. As the absolute central premise of all politicians, of all political policy, is that we need to have economic growth and we need to keep on having it. If not, the world's going to fall apart. Now, that sort of leads us to this basic contradiction, which we know is going to end at some point. And that is, if you have a system defined around an impossibility, at some point it is impossible, and therefore it changes in a profound way. Now, of course, all of you on this call tonight, by definition of your involvement with SLT, is sympathetic to these issues and understanding of them, but very few people are. Very few people really think about economic growth. You know, they might think about measuring it differently. They might think about, you know, the edges, but very few people threaten or challenge the underlying idea behind it. And that obviously is how we got into this mess in the first place. Now, the next thing I want to say about that, though, is that many people have argued that. My friend Jorgen Randers, one of the authors of the Club of Rome's Limits of Growth in 1972, you know, has been arguing it for a very long time. Many millions of people have had the conversation. But the advocacy is always, we should change the model, right? We should, by choice, recognize this is wrong and isn't going to be sustained and choose a different model. We should measure GDP. We shouldn't measure GDP, we should measure happiness. We should measure this, we should measure that, etc., well-being and so on. That, I think, has always been wrong, in the sense of that we're not ever going to choose that change. We're going to be forced to change. And the essence of my book that Helen referred to 10, 11 years ago was that we will change only when we're forced to, but we will be forced to because the nature of the model and assumption of infinite economic growth, you know, simply forces us to change at some point. Now, what I'd like to argue is we've kind of arrived at that point, right? That after, you know, another thing I say in speeches to the corporate audience is, you know, for 50 or 60 years, we've been arguing we should change the world, change the system. for the benefit of our children's children. Well, after 60 years, we're their children's children. So after that long, it's been multiple generations, and we are now inheriting the consequences. So for those of us like myself in the 60s or older, we feel that we've been part of that process all the way through. But the reality is, for most people today, they've inherited our lack of a decision. And most people today, by average demographic, are part of the generation who will inherit the failure of us to act earlier. And that also is a very powerful idea, because when we look around today, especially for those of us deeply involved in the issues, we kind of think of it's more of the same. And this, where we are today, is profoundly and fundamentally different than where we were 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And I want to talk a bit about that in a moment. So where we are now is we've come to the limits to growth. We're hitting them all around the world. And many of us focus on climate change, so it is wildfires or it is floods and droughts and so on. But we're hitting the limits in lots of different areas simultaneously. The issue, why we don't see that collectively, is because we see each of these issues as independent. We see climate change as an issue. We see inequality as an important issue. We see biodiversity loss as an important issue. We see soil degradation and agriculture and the unsustainability of food systems as a separate issue. We see the Ukraine war as oh my God, a surprise, a war coming in from the side. We see the pandemic in the same way. That is not the right way to see this. What we have is a system which is displaying symptoms of its unsustainability, and each of those symptoms cannot be understood except as a whole. Now, of course, they're interrelated. They're also not all completely one system, but they are fundamentally unified in the idea. Climate change, for example, will drive the frequency of zoonotic diseases, right? Climate change drives inequality. Inequality drives behavior, which reinforces climate change, right? We have wars like Ukraine. People kind of saw Putin invade Ukraine as a nationalist tendency, and then, oh my God, it's now surprisingly caused a food crisis. Well, that's not a surprise. That's one of the reasons that Putin invaded Ukraine was for resources, right? And control of resources is what happens when you start to hit the limits, right? And so that, without going into all those interconnections, we have to see and try to understand the system in that holistic way, because then we start to understand how it might change. So to stop the kind of opening comments, it's kind of hold on for the ride, because now it gets very messy. And I want to come in a moment, well, I'm sure we'll get questions on this, the optimism, pessimism, of the apocalypse or not, but it gets very, very messy from now on. And I want to use one issue to really emphasize that, which Helen referred to in the introduction, which is the issue of food and the issue of methane. So what we see today when I refer to hitting the limits is one of those most profound limits, of course, is climate change. And what we're seeing with climate change is the acceleration of the changes in the warming of the climate ahead of what was expected. Now, that's not surprising, because science is a very conservative body of work by nature. And so now here we are with the temperature as expected, but the emissions as expected, but the acceleration of warming being beyond what was expected. Now, what we're seeing as a result of that is implications for the food industry. What we're seeing is implications for geopolitics. What we're seeing is that we're most importantly seeing, and there's lots of press on this recently, we're seeing self-accelerating feedback starting to take hold, right? So we are seeing a rapid acceleration in methane levels in the atmosphere, which is partly a natural feedback and partly a human-driven feedback. When I say natural, I mean the natural feedback that we've caused with climate change is driving increasing methane. So what that gets us to collectively, to summarize without a lot of content in that area around, we're at a point where we are facing the potential for climate change accelerating out of control. Now, when I say out of control, I don't mean it spins off and everyone dies. What I mean is we can no longer control the rate of warming based on our emissions, because the natural feedbacks will actually do the work of accelerating the climate impacts. Now, people refer to that as like the Armageddon sort of moment where we can't control it anymore and the system spins out of control. Not impossible, but frankly not the most likely outcome. But we are facing a sense where the acceleration of warming is now our issue. So what I wrote about recently was, therefore, we need to shift our thinking away from emissions as our focus and towards warming as our focus. Now, on the one hand, that sort of seems obvious, that if you want to reduce warming, you have to reduce emissions. But if you really look into the science of that, it's not that simple. And in particular, it's not that simple when you compare methane to CO2. Now, the reason that's so important is if you understand that we need to slow warming to stop the acceleration of feedbacks, to stop the potential for runaway climate change, you have to slow warming, you have to cut methane. And the reason you have to cut methane is because there's no amount, this is very important to get your head around because it's a very controversial idea, there is no amount of CO2 emissions we can cut in the next 10 to 20 years that will slow warming in the next 10 to 20 years. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't cut CO2 dramatically with what I call with Jürgen Rander's the 1 degree wall plan kind of approach, but it will not slow warming for the simple reality that CO2 is a pollutant, right? As in, sorry, CO2 is a pollutant, but CO2 also comes with pollution, as in air pollution. And that air pollution, in particular aerosolized matter, actually reduces warming by having a cooling effect and filtering the sun coming in. So if we dramatically cut CO2 today, oil, coal and gas, which we have to do, we won't get any warming reduction, rate of warming reduction for a long time, 10 to 20 years, because we'll also reduce pollution, and that will unleash the warming already embedded in the system. Therefore, methane becomes the only really significant lever we have to dramatically reduce warming in the next 10 to 20 years, which is our #1 priority. So I know I'm putting a lot of big ideas out there quickly here, but let me just do that and we'll get into questions and answers and go into more detail on some of those issues. But let me, final comments get focused around food, because if you want to cut methane emissions, you have to change the food system. Now, the good news is the food system is fundamentally broken, right? And I say good news in the sense that we have to change it anyway. And what that means is we have to recognize that dramatic change in the food system to reduce methane emissions basically means transformation of the livestock industry, right? And there's two aspects of that. One is, which most NGOs argue for correctly, we have to dramatically reduce consumption, right, of meat and dairy. Now, we have to do that quickly, and we have to do it across society, because that is the fastest way to reduce livestock numbers, is by consumer behavior change. Now, the problem with that, which we have to do, the problem with that, which is that most people won't do it, right? So therefore, you have to also look at alternative ways of reducing methane from the existing livestock industry, which are coming along, seaweed, etc. Lots of different products and ideas in that area, which I think are very important. And you have to also look at diet change, not to veganism from animals, which is obviously part of the solution, but you have to look at that also as going from beef to pork, from pork to chicken, from chicken to fish, from fish, etc., down the line. And that change in diet is something that we can achieve at large scale and would have a very significant impact. But livestock, beef and dairy, is the #1 issue. And the reason we need to change that is that that's where we get the biggest shift. Final comment as to why that's so important, and then I'll stop and summarising, throw it open to questions. But the final comment on that is that this is unlike fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are very, very different in the economy, in the market, because they're large, long life assets, large, long life physical infrastructure, which takes a long time to turn over. Right, so yes, you can shut down an existing gas or coal plant, but it normally takes a long time. And in the market, it always takes a long time. Whereas if you have less consumption of meat and dairy livestock use this year, then literally the emissions change the next year because the farmers produce less. This is not about big assets and physical infrastructure. This is about the ability of what farmers do to change their patterns of behaviour in response to the market. And so therefore pricing of methane, policy on methane, campaigns against livestock consumption and meat and dairy, etc., is all part of that process. So I'm going to stop there, but just to summarize all that really, is that we have to start thinking about, I think, as activists, that as opposed to the world changing because we want it to change because it'd be a nicer world if it did, all true, we have to start recognizing the world's going to change because it's going to be forced to. And when the world's changed because it's forced to, it means that the market and policy have outsized influence in that process. And what that means is for activists and for activist organizations, we have to really think about where's the most influence we can have in that context, and how do we influence markets in particular to accelerate that change. And that's, I think, a really rich area for conversation as well in terms of the role of the activist community. So let me stop there, Todd, Helen, and throw it back to you.
Mm-hmm. So we have a few questions.
Yeah, let me jump so I can see them there now, Helen. Sorry, I'm paying attention.
Would you like to just take them?
Yes.
Yeah, take them.
I will.
Yeah. Yeah.
So one of the ones there from Simon Alston is the importance of controlled grazing, or rotational grazing, it's often called, to repair degraded soils, promote carbon capture, and so on. I think that's a really interesting area, and I absolutely think we should be pushing for that. The thing I've learned from probably too many years as an activist is how long it takes for systems to change. And the issue with rotational grazing, which I personally have been a big advocate for 15 years or so, is that it has a range of benefits to the agricultural system. It has a range of benefits to nature in terms of soil carbon, enriching soil, protecting against drought and so on. And it's also, better for the cows as well. But the issue there is we're not going to transform the system fast enough to achieve that in the time frame that I'm talking about, if we rely upon that as the primary mechanism for change. That idea has been around for decades. Alan Savory listed there by Simon as an example. And yet, I've done tours of carbon-focused farms in Western New South Wales, big, 10,000 acre kind of farms. People have been doing this for a long time. It works. The evidence is very clear. And yet the farmers who live next door and see the results aren't even picking it up, right? So I say that not to criticize it as a concept, because it's the right concept, right? The issue is that it won't change as fast enough, and we're now at the absolute sharp edge of this issue, and we need warlike mobilization in terms of our response.
So one of the things you haven't touched on, Paul, is food miles as well.
Yep.
So if I can get beef from the guy who has a few cattle next to me, as opposed to soy product from China, that I don't know how is produced. I don't know what chemicals are used, what the water usage is. How does that compare to the benefits of, cutting back altogether?
Yeah, look, I think the lot of issues in that area. Sorry, I just lost train of thought. I was reading one of the questions. Remind me again, Helen. Sorry, what was the question?
The food miles, as it
food miles. So I think,
products.
Yeah, a good question, and I think it's a bit like back to how the system works. I think we should be eating locally for a whole range of reasons, right? But I think we shouldn't be obsessed by local versus elsewhere in its own right for its own sake. Now, from a climate change perspective. So what I mean by that is that we had a situation well catalogued in the UK where people were arguing for, against, for example, buying from organic farming in Africa in favour of buying industrial farmed food from the UK. Right? Now, the reality is that a lot of food is transported by ship, right? The CO2, the carbon content of that is actually very low, and the production process is actually more influential on that. I'm not saying it doesn't matter, but what I'm saying is, I want to buy food from Tasmania because I want Tasmania to be resilient as a state and as a place to live. I want it because it's going to be more likely to be in a quality controlled area versus China, for example, as you mentioned, Helen. I think they're all really good points, but I think we should see it as part of the mix and not in isolation. Now, there's some things like you shouldn't buy blueberries flown in from America, right? So clearly anything that's flown in is going to be off the menu, but I think there's a whole bunch of opportunities there that I think are different from that, which we should be a bit careful of. Let me pick up this question that Milka just posted about meat from the lab. I'm really interested in this one. This is one of my kind of hot button issues, and I don't have a clear view on it, but I'm totally fascinated by it. And I think this is a really interesting one, is that there's a whole bunch of technologies coming down the track where we're going to be able to produce things very differently. And we kind of see lab grown meat and think of, you know, solvent green, for those of us who remember that, as sort of this horrible laboratory food. Don't think of it like that. Think of it as an example. You know, we brew beer, right? We can actually possibly brew milk, right? There's a company in which I work with in the Netherlands that produces algal fish oil, which is chemically identical to the wild-caught fish oil that we get from overfishing the ocean from the algae. And they can grow fish oil and use it for an input into human supplements or into aquaculture, and therefore reduce the pressure on wild-caught fish. Now, some of this stuff is not going to work. Some of it's going to be environmentally damaging. We won't understand it until we get there. But I think we have to be very careful, because the whole area is actually quite powerful as an opportunity. People are brewing, fermenting, growing laboratory stuff all the time. And I think in this area, a lot of money going into it. And the second thing, we have a lot of this internal conversation at a foundation that we run in, I help run and finance in the UK on this. And the issue here is that we're uncomfortable with technology and corporate production of food, right? And we're uncomfortable with that for a very good reason, is that their behavior has been appalling forever, right? So I'm not saying we shouldn't be very skeptical of that, but there is some technologies in this area which could be incredibly beneficial socially, right? So in the same way, renewable energy reduces the reliance on imports, and is therefore very beneficial for small countries and for small villages, for example, with renewable power. The same thing can apply to some of this food technology, where people can produce more powerful, more beneficial, more nutritious food locally than by growing it, by buying it from the global market, and therefore reducing the risk in this area. So I think that's one thing. The second thing is that we, you know, and I include me in this, we have this incredibly luxurious lifestyle in Tasmania in particular, of incredibly good locally produced food, right? And we can afford it, and we can eat really well with very little impact in terms of our quality of life to pay for the right sort of food. Most people in the world eat shit, right? I mean, like processed food, rubbish food, if they're of a sort of medium, middle or higher income, or if they're the lower income, they're eating very simple, not very nutritious food. Now, in both those cases, many of these technologies are going to be extremely beneficial. So, for example, in cultured meat, it's going to be very hard to make a steak or a lamb chop, you know, from cultured meat. It's going to be incredibly easy to make ground beef, for example, from cultured meat, relatively speaking. And yet, and ground beef is 40% of the beef market in the US, right? Dairy, for example, a huge amount of dairy goes into manufactured goods, goes into ice cream, goes into whatever, at which point whether the input is natural or not is actually irrelevant. It's just an input to an industrial process. It's going to make us feel uncomfortable because it's not sort of food that we want to eat, but it is going to have a big impact, I think, in terms of society more broadly. I'm just going to pick random questions here because I can't follow them all. So if you don't get an answer, feel free to flag it again. Di Elif talked about, does this mean we need to create a methane market and set limits somehow? Absolutely. So one thing I've really become convinced about from working in the corporate sector and markets and thinking about markets for a very long time is that governments and companies are very bad at picking technologies and picking solutions. And we get incredibly caught up in what I call the ideological framework around technologies. So pretty much nobody on this call is going to support nuclear power in Tasmania, right? And if I get onto some other call full of people from a different persuasion, pretty much none of them are going to support solar and wind, right? Because they see it as an ideological question, right? And governments, as we've just seen with the previous government, get caught up in that process. And so I don't want governments picking technologies. I do want governments subsidizing things and putting in place policies to drive markets towards a solution. And methane is such an example. I don't want companies or governments to be picking their favorite methane solution. I want everyone who emits methane to be paying a price for it or to have it limited in some way. And that, I think, is therefore, as we've learned with carbon, that is the best way to do it. Just another one here from Paul Gibson. Hi, Paul. Protein from insects. Again, very good example why I'm answering it now from my last point. I think all these ideas are worth exploring. And I think it's very hard to say that now which ones will succeed and which ones won't and which ones are right. Right. And I think we have to be very careful to let 1,000 flowers bloom in terms of these technologies. I personally think insects are really interesting. And I think they're particularly interesting for that industrialized input of agriculture, which is where most of our Western agriculture goes to. So, for example, insects being used to feed animals, to use in aquaculture, to produce protein in manufactured products, which is a very significant part of the global market. Right? I think it's going to take a while to get customer acceptance of that as a pure product. Speaking of someone who went to Mexico and had a big bowl full of grasshoppers or something, and it was pretty disgusting. But I think that kind of, there's no question that we have to explore all those things. So back to the question about methane pricing, that's also part of that sort of process, I think, as well. I don't know what you mean, Cheryl, but I'm going to have a stab anyway about what do you recommend order of changes that society has to take. So I think if you mean which order should we do things in all at once, and I think the issue there is that we are now facing a serious crisis, right? And that does mean we have to do everything simultaneously, and it's going to be, as a result, inefficient and not in a methodical, ordered way. But I think that basic idea that you need to throw everything at this now is the right sort of answer. Hope that got somewhere towards the question. Bill Harvey, Peter Gutman in March 21 said he wants to be carbon neutral tourism in Tasmania by 2025 to keep Tasmania competitive. How realistic is this and how could it be achieved maybe in a longer time frame? So Tasmania is so well positioned in this area. I'm not a techie person to understand the precise measurements and whether we include forestry or don't, and how we count the exports of energy and imports of energy and so on. But I think having that as a theme for Tasmania is such an underdone idea. I know you're having another one of these forums on electric vehicles later in the year, and that's a really obvious one for Tasmania. So I think one really worthwhile. But it's such a good idea to promote tourism. I mean, before we all came on, Margaret and Helen and I were talking about the danger of everyone moving to Tasmania around the world and us being overrun with rich white people who are escaping from the collapsing world. And that's a serious issue. But right now, the issue is that we have got an opportunity to genuinely showcase what a renewable, sustainable state could look like in Australia and in the world. And I think it would be incredibly good for our economy. If we do it right, it would be good for our way of life for those who live here as well. But my fear is that tourism, for example, becomes giant hotels and big tourism, as opposed to the stuff that we have now that people come for. Likewise, the food production becomes big dairy because we're clean and green, or big aquaculture, because we're clean and green, which of course is not the case if we keep on doing that kind of stuff. So we have to, I think, aggressively assert that small, is not a kind of token greeny kind of philosophical point of view about how our economy should look. It's an entirely logical, market-driven approach that actually would deliver a better state, a better economy, and a more resilient economy as well, which I think is also incredibly important.
Well, can I chip in with a question
Please.
then? I've discovered I can't access the Q&A, so I'm just going to pull rank and chip in. Some ideas for what a community organisation like Sustainable Living Tasmania can contribute to this sort of crisis action. What should we be doing?
Look, I think I was actually having an email with, back and forth with Jonathan Porritt, who's a friend of mine from the UK, very well-known advocate in this area. And he actually referred, he said something which I thought was really interesting. He said, I think we're talking about methane and the need to move to warming and a crisis response, and recognising that methane had to get a much bigger focus. And he said, I think our biggest issue, our biggest barrier to that is the climate establishment. And I thought it was a really interesting idea. And what he meant when I went back and forwards with him on it was that we have a establishment now of climate change advocates, right, who are locked into their way of thinking, big institutions, large amounts of funding, career paths, etc. Now, that's a good thing, don't get me wrong, because it means the issue is so mainstream. But to your point, Margaret, the issue is that we get locked into our own ways of thinking as well. As you said in opening, that this idea of these forums is to try and provoke people into different ways of seeing the world. Now, I think that there is this sort of, there's optimism and pessimism, there's optimism versus doomers, there's etc. And I think that framing is completely wrong. And I think this goes to answer your question. What we can do as advocates is to acknowledge, look, guys, it is actually as bad as you think it could be, plus 100%, right? And it really is that serious. And by the way, saying in the same breath, and by the way, therefore, we have a great opportunity to change really quickly, right? So we have to not get stuck in our in the assumptions we've been making. The methane versus emissions one is a good example of it. We'll not get stuck in this idea of incremental market-driven change when things will happen, when people choose to make them happen. We have to be more aggressive in terms of policy. But the fundamental thing is to recognise and to say very clearly, we are facing a global existential crisis, right? And to say that, and then immediately start talking about the incredible opportunities that we have to respond to that. And in particular, to your question in Tasmania, how we can be a showcase of that. So it's all about speed of change, but we tend to shy away from it, as I'm doing. I just did a thing today on LinkedIn, or wrote one, I haven't put it up yet, on this idea of doom and gloom, you know, doomers versus optimists. An article I read in The Guardian from a scientist in this area, and it was about this very idea that we think we have to either be, it's all going to be fine, we can fix it, there's no problem, don't panic, we have opportunities over here. That's wrong, right? We also, or we're actually totally screwed. The world's going to fall apart, civilization is going to collapse, right? It's probably the extinction of human civilization, and we're all going to die, right? Also wrong, right? Both of those are technically wrong, by the way, which we can discuss, right? But they're also strategically wrong, in the sense that you have to be aggressively clear about the scale of the crisis and how fast we have to move, and then aggressively strong in terms of how fast we can change and the economic benefits of doing so. Does that answer your question, Margaret? Because you can answer me now.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess it's what I'm getting to be thinking. I've spent a large part of my career years ago, decades ago, talking about the small changes we all can make that will eventually turn the great ocean liner of the economy and the environment around, and then realizing that basically that's not doing it. And yeah.
Well, I think that, you know, it's a constant issue that we have to all ask ourselves all the time. What is the most powerful way, you know, we can do things now? Good question here from David Butler on that regard. What are your favourite potential government policies? And I think I think my answer absolutely is those where you trigger, your point, Margaret, you trigger the personal change, right? We had this with solar on rooftops, right? Which was that, you know, solar on rooftops was what wackos did. government put in place policies that incentivise people to do it personally. Then it became normalised, right? And therefore the individual actions happen not because of the consumer preference for saving the world, but because they thought, God, there's a buck in this, I can do this. And then there was this, what they call it the solar snowball effect, where once you got past 50% of houses in a suburb with solar, it quickly, which was really hard to get to, it quickly went 90%. Right? Because people looked around and said, oh my God, everyone else is doing it. I better be doing it. What am I missing out on? Whereas when it's all of us greenies doing it, that doesn't happen. Right? So so you're right in the sense that personal change is incredibly important, but government policy has to be on deployment, on large scale deployment, as opposed to research and far away future possibilities. We've got to get, and that's where the solar feed-in tariffs was so powerful. Norway electric cars, for example, I think another example.
I see there's more questions.
Yeah.
From
Let me get
other
on to
people. Yep.
Celia. Curious as to why it will be easier to change the entire population's diet rather than the methodology of how farmers graze cattle. Perhaps looking at behaviour change is as critical as what to change to. Really good question, Celia. So the reason it's easier, I think, to change the entire population's diet is because we can do it with policy, right, incentives, and the momentum of consumer tendency. Whereas changing farmer behaviour, actually, and I've seen it not happen for many, many years in various places, is that it's a personal choice of the farmer, and the farmer tends to be a conservative, slow to change demographic. Now, you can force that with policy, but then you have to actually do quite a substantial cultural change program across the agricultural sector. And the evidence is that doesn't happen. And therefore, I think societal wide diet change, actually, funnily enough, is easier than changing how farmers do things. And by the way, then farmers will follow, because they'll recognise they're losing their market, right, and need to change it if they're to keep some. Maureen Corbett, local food production is very important, not only for reducing food miles, but also for food security in general. Absolutely correct. Governments have a responsibility to support local food industries for the good of their constituents. In the case of Tasmania, the government is supporting and subsidising through new infrastructure, mega international fish farming companies all open to selling to any countries in the world, saying we'll feed the world. Very good examples of what I was talking about, that small is beautiful. One of those great old books of the environmental area is completely right in Tasmania. Never has it been better as an economic strategy. That if we position, like New Zealand's a good example. So New Zealand has positioned itself as clean and green, right, has this whole tourism and food advocacy around that area, and relative to many countries it is. But I sit on the advisory board of Fonterra, and so I know a lot about the dairy industry there. They have completely screwed, right, pretty much not every, but I think something like half the lakes and streams and creeks of New Zealand aren't swimmable because of the pollution from runoff, right? So they have done enormous damage to their clean green reality, right, by going for large scale industrialized, even though it's grazing, it's still at industrial scale. They've caused enormous damage, and the same issue in Tasmania, right? If we go down the big aquaculture, big dairy route, we'll be just screwing the thing that they're using to promote themselves, right? And we have to be clever about how to do that, as opposed to just opposing things. How do we advocate a stronger, more powerful way of doing it? John, methane pricing, isn't this already priced in carbon markets? No, surprisingly, I'll come to that, which are based on CO2 equivalents, which include methane emissions, assuming a specific lifetime, which is, of course, controversial. Two really important points there. One is no. The first point, I think New Zealand, from memory, is the only country in the world that has methane incorporated into its carbon market. And even then, has different rules. So problem number one, people don't because they're scared of the farm lobby. Right. Problem two, also in your question, is that methane is not a 100-year impact. And therefore, currently, all carbon markets that talk, or any carbon pricing ideas that talk about methane, have it over 100 years, and that's wrong, right? Because we have a warming issue, the impact of methane should be counted over 10 to 20 years. It goes for about 12. But if you do it over 10 years, it's like 100 times as bad as CO2. So if we are going to price methane as part of a carbon market, we have to get the time frame right as well. Just checking in with you, Todd, because you flashed on the screen and disappeared again at my end. Shall I keep going, or do you want to wrap it up?
That's all right. The moment's passed. You keep going, Paul.
Okay, sorry, you wanted to ask a question. Bill Harvey, Hobart announced the major upgrade for growth in passenger numbers. What does peak tourism look like, and how do we prepare for such growth? Would a tourist levy help? There is so much evidence around the world now of how to screw up tourism, right? And so many countries, Venice is the kind of showcase example, where tourist buses being splattered with rotten tomatoes by frustrated locals. People there who are wildly celebrating COVID because they got their city back. There's lots and lots of examples of why tourism can be very bad for the society they're visiting, very bad for the local people, and very bad for tourism ultimately, because you undermine the very idea of the thing people are coming for, right? So I think you have to be really clever about this. There are plenty of opportunities for policies in this area, tourist levies, etc. I think as part of the issue, people like Bhutan have a minimum spend to get the right sort of tourism to come there. Now, there's lots of ways you can do this, and lots of policies you could put in place if you chose to, right? Putting taxes on Airbnbs, limiting the impacts on local accommodation, etc. But there's also a lot of opportunity in tourism if you get it right. But it does require, again, to the points earlier, advocacy groups like SLT really getting into. We have to get that idea across first, that tourism has limits, right? And the wrong tourism has shorter limits. And having that debate, which I do not see happening in the tourism industry, is a real problem. Then we can talk about the policies to deal with that, but not until then. Frank Stree, have you met and discussed with Albert Bates and Kathleen Draper, the 29 co-authors of the book Burn, Using Fire to Cool the Earth? If not, you and the SLT team might like to listen to the audio version. I think it's just a comment. I'm not familiar with it. I'm certainly familiar with the very creative ideas of Aboriginal burning, for example, in the climate change area, which I think is super interesting as a way of alleviating the risk of that area and encouraging regrowth, etc. So I think that's also worth looking at. The rest of it just a suggestion for people. Linda, hi Linda. How is solar and wind sustainable when the energy sources are renewable, but the infrastructure isn't, and will continue to require extraction, etc., forever? So is this really sustainable, or something we should be relying on to such an extent, when reduction can be done cheaply and immediately and doesn't require ongoing inputs? One of the great questions and issues in the whole sustainability space. Do we actually need to stop growth and go through degrowth? There's a great organization in America, which I was a fellow at for a long time, the Post-Carbon Institute, which is really powerful on this issue, that there is no amount of energy that we can produce in renewables to actually save us from climate change. I don't know what the right answer is in that, to be frank, because resource extraction isn't necessarily bad if it's iron ore done the right way with your renewable inputs, etc. Right? If it's non, so it's not that resource extraction is inherently bad. It's about how much land you use, how you produce it, how much diesel you use in the process, how much is recycled, etc. So I'm not sure that we know the answer to that question yet. There are big issues in batteries, in rare earths, in metals and recycling, but most of those things we sort out over time. And I'm always looking for the systemic risks, the systemic threats. And I think that we're going to come to the limits of solar and wind by doing lots of it, right? And there will be limits, and we're not sure what they are, but we're sure as hell not against them now. And that, I think, is a really, you get boosterism in this area from people who think there really are no limits and we can do it forever. And you get people like Richard from Post-Carbon Institute who say we are so far past the limits today, there is no chance of getting there. So I think that's really important. But the second part of your question, Linda, when reduction can be done cheaply and immediately and doesn't require ongoing inputs, absolutely, whatever energy system we have, energy efficiency is still the greatest, bizarrest, weirdest, stupidest thing that we don't do. Right? It's such a no-brainer to do energy efficiency at scale, and yet policy in that area is still surprisingly weak, let alone, my title of my book, The Great Disruption, the coming climate crisis and the end of shopping. Right? I didn't talk about this in opening, but that's a profound part of the equation. Reduction isn't just about energy, reduction is about stuff, right? And we now know that once you get past the basic human needs are being met, which 95% of people are at in Tasmania, then buying more stuff doesn't make you any happier, right? And yet the whole economy depends upon that idea, and I think that's a really, really powerful idea. I know we're running out of time soon, so I want to jump into a few quickly. What do you think, Sandy Esther? What do you think of the idea of our food becoming a tourist attraction? P.S. I live in Launceston, the city of gastronomy, and the only focus now is for agritourism. I think this is a really exciting area, not just because I own the Port Signet Cannery, so I'm very focused on that and agritourism. But I think if someone said to me after I wrote an article about the lab-based meat and fermented food and moving away from agriculture, George Monbiot has written some really powerful stuff on this, saying how we need to get land back for nature. And the only way to achieve that is to actually forget most agriculture that we have today and move into different technologies, different approaches, lifestyle change included. And I said, oh, what does it mean for Tasmania? I have a farm in Tasmania, grow all my own food, blah, blah, blah. And I said to them, I think we'll become a museum for the global food industry, for tourism and for study. And it was part of a joke, but it was really actually a serious idea that we can do agriculture in a way in Tasmania, which people are going to love and find increasingly hard to find and see and experience. And therefore small-scale farming, which is the focus of the cannery, which I operate in Signet historically, it was a local farmers co-op to market their apples. Our philosophy now is we're there to promote agriculture to the people and help farmers make a living from agriculture. So small-scale farming, right, with farmers markets, etc., but having it as a whole integrated economic model of tourism, etc., I think is a super powerful idea for this. Okay, sorry. Okay, yep, got that, Todd, thanks. Do you support, from Kirsten, do you support regenerative grazing practices as an alternative to mitigate emissions that are emitted from CAFO operations? Is it the how, not the cow? And secondly, from Celia, there's a cohort of farmers in Tasmania who want to influence policy to be made holistically accounting for environmental, cultural, economic and social consequences as per Savory's framework. We need expertise on lobbying, etc. Where do we go for help, advice and action? So, but I think this really comes to my last answer as well. There is enormous potential in Tasmania for serious academic research, but also advocacy through doing, right, that we can do agriculture differently. Do I think that will actually get us there worldwide and stop the climate change? No, I don't. I think it's got no hope in hell of doing that. Right? Do I think it's worth doing? Absolutely, because the world needs the knowledge, right? Tasmania needs the food, and it's an incredibly good way of enhancing the local economy in a sustainable way. So I think, the sort of issues you're talking about, how do we have policy to do that? How do we advocate for that? I think the reality of every government in Tasmania historically really is that you have to make the economic case for doing that, right? So I think if we make the environmental, social, cultural case for that, we won't get very far. If we make the case as being integrated, small-scale agriculture, small-scale tourism, right, with a focus on inequality and renewables, then you have a package which makes sense economically for Tasmania, which people would support. And the majority of the business community in Tasmania, which remember the majority is small-scale businesses, would also support. So I think making that case, where do we go for help? What's the advice and action? I think we have to advocate this as a kind of statewide economic strategy, and then from that have the policy to actually encourage it. Whew. Okay, Todd, we got through them all.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much, Paul. One of the things that you've touched on, which is dear to my heart, is the whole issue of ongoing and rampant consumerism. And I think that it's very hard to find organisations who'll take this on. I remember a few years ago when I worked at Sustainable Living Tasmania, we were discussing trying to get grants to take on the whole consumeristic ideologue of the people, that there was nobody, you know, that would fund this because everybody's got a vested interest. So, you know, I think it's one thing in Tasmania we've got to try and deal with too, is that thing of circular economies, trying to look at reducing our consumption and creating industries around that. You know, repair cafes, there was one really good example of something that's, you know, taken off around Hobart, which is fantastic. So, you know, there are lots of issues that you've brought up, lots of food for thought. So thank you very much.
Good, thank you.
And yeah, and I'm sure you've provoked a lot of us into thinking what we can do and what Sustainable Living Tasmania can do. And certainly we'd like our members' thoughts on future forums. We'd like feedback about speakers, about what future forums might look like. We've got one planned for October the 26th, which is around Transition Towns movement. And we'll have a speaker from the Tamar Transition Movement talking about her experiences, plus several people from around Australia who will talk about their transition towns. So that's worth tuning in to. There'll be lots of promotion done on that in the meantime. But certainly, please feel free as members and supporters to give your feedback about future topics. Certainly electrification of vehicles is one thing that we want to do. I'd also like to thank Todd Husteen, who was the technical advisor tonight and kept us on the straight and narrow, and Sandy Astle for handling the promotion for tonight's e-forum. So it was a joint volunteer effort, so thank you everybody. And just to remind people that we have our AGM coming up on Wednesday, September the 28th at 5:30 p.m. at the Hobart Town Hall. And along this theme that we've kind of touched on tonight, we have a guest speaker, Lisa Villeneuve, who will speak on resilience and resilience programs that are happening around Australia. So try and come along to that. 5:30 Wednesday, September the 28th. Also, as Margaret mentioned, we've got our 50th birthday celebrations happening, and you can find out more information about these on our website. So please check into that. Thanks again, Paul, and thank you everybody for joining in. This is the first of many, hopefully, successful e-forums that we'll hold over the coming years. And Sustainable Living Tasmania is back. So keep in touch. And also we need board members. So if you come along to AGM, it would be great if you're nominated as a board member. So thank you, everybody, and good evening.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.